Malcolm was just a 12-year-old boy trying to survive in a world that never gave him a chance. But one night, everything changed. A desperate woman, a deadly secret, and a chase that could cost him everything. What happens next will leave you speechless. Stay till the end to see how one boy's courage defied all odds. If you stand against injustice, comment 77. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. New York City, 2017. Among the towering skyscrapers and endless noise, 12-year-old Malcolm Johnson lived in a cramped, one-bedroom apartment with his mother, Angela. The walls were cracked, the pipes leaked, and space was so limited they could barely move around without bumping into something. But, despite the poor conditions, Angela kept their home as warm and welcoming as possible, decorating it with whatever she could afford and keeping it spotless. She wanted Malcolm to feel safe, even when the world outside their door was anything but. Angela Johnson was the definition of resilience. She had spent her entire life fighting against the odds, determined to give her son the best she could with what little she had. Malcolm's father had walked out on them when he was just a baby, leaving Angela to raise him alone. She had never received a dime in child support and had no family to rely on. It had always been just the two of them against the world. She worked long shifts at a gas station, standing on her feet all day, dealing with impatient customers and the suffocating smell of gasoline. It barely covered rent, utilities, and groceries, but she made sure Malcolm never saw her struggle. She hid her exhaustion behind a smile and made sure her son never felt like they were poor, even though they were barely scraping by. Every morning, Angela woke up at dawn to prepare breakfast for Malcolm. If they had enough money, it was toast with peanut butter. If they didn't, it was just cereal with water. No matter what, she always kissed his forehead and whispered, "Rise and shine, my king. You've got a whole world to conquer today." Malcolm never complained, never asked for more. He knew his mother worked too hard to give him even the smallest luxuries, so he never begged for new sneakers or the latest video games like the other kids at school. He understood that every dollar mattered. After breakfast, Angela would walk Malcolm to school, holding his hand tightly. "Be great today," she always said before rushing off to her grueling shift at the gas station. There, she worked under a cruel and greedy boss, William Carter, who barely paid her enough to survive and treated her like she was disposable. But she endured it all for Malcolm. When school ended, Malcolm would sit outside on the cracked steps of the school, waiting for his mother. Most kids had parents who picked them up in nice cars or took them out for fast food. Malcolm didn't mind waiting, even if it meant sitting alone while everyone else left. When Angela finally arrived, exhausted but smiling, she would ask about his day and listen attentively to every word. At home, they shared whatever meal they could stretch out, sometimes just rice and beans, sometimes a small portion of meat that Angela made sure Malcolm got the bigger share of. If there wasn't enough food, Angela pretended she wasn't hungry. At night, they sat together and talked. "One day, things will be better," Angela would whisper as she ran her fingers through Malcolm's curls. "One day, I'm going to take care of you, Ma," Malcolm would always promise. Angela smiled, but deep down she worried. She was barely holding on, and things were only getting worse. Angela knew their money was running out. She had been saving every penny she could, but it wasn't enough. Rent was due soon, and she had no idea how she was going to pay it. Malcolm noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands trembled when she thought he wasn't looking. One evening, as they sat at their small dining table, Angela sighed heavily. "Malcolm, I need to tell you something. He looked up, sensing the worry in her voice. "What is it, Ma?" Angela hesitated before speaking. "Rent is due next week, and I don't have the money." Malcolm swallowed hard. He was just a kid, but he knew what that meant. No rent money meant they would be homeless. "I'll help, Ma," he said firmly. "I'll find a way." Angela forced a smile, but tears welled in her eyes. "You're just a boy, baby," she whispered. "It's not your job to take care of me." But Malcolm had already made up his mind. He would do whatever it took to help his mother. He just didn't know that their entire world was about to collapse. The next morning started like any other. Cold, quiet, and uncertain, but filled with the familiar warmth of Angela's presence. She woke Malcolm up, made him a simple breakfast of toast and eggs, and kissed his forehead before walking him to school. Though she smiled, Malcolm noticed the weariness in her eyes, the silent exhaustion from years of struggle. As she squeezed his hand a little tighter than usual before letting go at the school gates, Malcolm felt a deep sense of unease clawing at his chest. "Love you, Ma," he called out. Angela smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Love you more, baby," she said before hurrying away toward the gas station where she would spend the next several hours pretending the weight of the world wasn't crushing her shoulders. Malcolm went about his school day, but his mind kept drifting back to his mother. Her tired hands, her forced smile, her quiet sighs when she thought no one was listening. He knew something was wrong. He could feel it deep inside, but he didn't know how to fix it. Then, just before noon, the world as he knew it shattered. The ground shook violently, and a deafening explosion tore through the air. A thick cloud of black smoke rose into the sky. The entire city seemed to pause in horror. Within moments, sirens screamed from all directions, fire trucks, ambulances, police cars, all racing towards the source of the explosion. Malcolm's heart slammed against his ribs as his classmates gasped, pointing toward the sky. The explosion had come from the direction of his mother's job. His breath hitched, his vision blurred. "No, no, no." He whispered the words, but they did nothing to stop the panic clawing at his chest. Without thinking, without asking for permission, he ran. He sprinted out of the school, dodging traffic, ignoring the shouts of teachers and strangers. His legs burned, but his fear burned hotter. The closer he got, the more his nightmare became real. The gas station was in flames. Fire swallowed everything. Glass shattered across the pavement. The smell of burning fuel filled the air. Firefighters fought desperately to contain the blaze, their hoses spraying endless streams of water against the relentless inferno. People screamed. Paramedics rushed to help the injured. Police officers tried to control the panicked crowd, but Malcolm saw none of it. His eyes searched for one person. "Mom!" he screamed, his voice raw. He shoved past people, his small frame barely noticeable in the chaos. "Mom!" Then he saw her, his mother, his whole world. Lying on the ground near an ambulance, her face contorted in pain, her arms wrapped in blood-soaked bandages. Her hands, the hands that had tucked him in at night, that had held him when he was scared, that had worked tirelessly to keep him fed, were mangled, burned, barely recognizable. He collapsed beside her, grabbing her arm, his small fingers trembling. "Mom, I'm here! I'm here!" he cried. Angela, despite her agony, managed to lift her eyes to him. She offered a weak, painful smile. "Hey, baby," she whispered. Malcolm's breath hitched as he stared at her injured hands, wrapped so tightly that the bandages were already turning red. "You're going to be okay, right?" His voice cracked. Angela didn't answer right away. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away, trying to stay strong for him. She reached out, or tried to, but her hands barely moved. A horrifying realization struck Malcolm in that moment. His mother, the strongest woman he knew, could never work again. She was broken, and with her, so was their entire world. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and quiet despair, the walls painted in a dull beige that seemed to drain the life out of everything inside. Malcolm sat beside his mother's hospital bed, his small fingers wrapped around her bandaged ones, feeling the heat of her pain even through the thick layers of gauze. Angela Johnson, the strongest woman he had ever known, lay still, her face pale, her once vibrant eyes now clouded with exhaustion and silent grief. The doctors had done what they could. The burns on her hands were severe, deep enough to leave permanent scars, enough to take away her ability to work, possibly even to function normally again. Malcolm felt the weight of that reality crushing him. His mother had spent her entire life working to provide for him, sacrificing sleep, health, and happiness just to make sure there was food on the table, just to keep a roof over their heads. And now, the very hands that had held their entire world together had been taken from her. The doctor had spoken softly, carefully, but no amount of gentle words could soften the truth. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but your hands have suffered extreme damage. The burns are deep, the nerves are compromised. Full recovery is unlikely. You will have difficulty gripping objects, writing, even doing basic tasks. You will need therapy, but I don't want to give you false hope. You might not regain full function." Malcolm had seen the way his mother's face had crumpled for just a moment before she quickly masked it with forced strength, nodding stiffly as if she could will the truth away by accepting it. But Malcolm wasn't fooled. He saw the silent devastation in her eyes, the unspoken fear curling around her like a shadow. How would they survive now? No work meant no money. No money meant no home. No home meant they had nothing. Absolutely nothing. The weight of that realization sat heavy on Malcolm's small shoulders, heavier than any 12-year-old should ever have to bear. And yet, the world wasn't done punishing them. The very next morning, the phone rang. Malcolm had been dozing off in the hospital chair beside his mother when the sound pierced through the sterile silence of the room. Angela, still weak, struggled to pick up the phone with her bandaged fingers, her face twisting in pain as she held it to her ear. "Hello?" Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Malcolm sat up, watching as the blood drained from her face, her lips parting slightly as if she was trying to breathe through a sudden wave of shock. Then her shoulders started shaking. "Please, don't do this. I just need a little time," she said, her voice cracking. A moment later, she closed her eyes and exhaled shakily. "I understand." She slowly lowered the phone, staring at nothing. "Who was it?" Malcolm asked, his chest tightening, already knowing the answer before she even said it. "The gas station owner," she whispered, her voice barely holding together. "I've been fired." Malcolm's fists clenched so tight his nails dug into his palms. Of course they fired her. That cold, heartless bastard didn't even have the decency to wait until she was out of the hospital before tossing her aside like she was worthless. "He gave me a little bit of severance pay," Angela continued, forcing a weak, bitter smile. "Enough to last us maybe 2 weeks. After that..." She trailed off, shaking her head. She didn't have to finish the sentence. After that, they were on the streets. Malcolm felt his throat tighten. He had never seen his mother this broken before. Angela Johnson was a fighter, a warrior, a woman who had always stood tall despite the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. But now her body sagged against the hospital bed, her once proud posture slumped with defeat. And Malcolm hated it. He hated that he had to sit there and watch the strongest person he knew lose everything. He hated that there was nothing he could do to take away her pain. He hated the world for being so cruel, so unfair, so relentless in its ability to keep them trapped in misery. And most of all, he hated the feeling of helplessness choking him like a chain around his throat. That helplessness only grew stronger when they returned home 2 days later. Angela, still weak, her hands trembling with even the smallest movements, barely managed to walk up the steps to their tiny apartment. But when Malcolm opened the door, something inside him twisted. The apartment felt different now. It was the same tiny, cramped space, the same decorations Angela had lovingly put up over the years, the same mismatched furniture they had collected from thrift stores and garage sales. But now it felt darker, emptier, heavier, because now it was no longer just a home. It was a ticking time bomb waiting to be ripped away from them. That reality slammed into them hard when just one day after Angela returned home, there was a loud, sharp knock on the door. Angela, still struggling to move her hands, motioned for Malcolm to get it. With a sinking feeling in his stomach, he opened the door and found himself face to face with Mr. Harris, their landlord. A tall, balding man with a permanent scowl, he looked down at Malcolm with the expression of someone who had no time for pity. "Where's your mother?" he grunted. Malcolm hesitated, then stepped aside as Angela struggled to her feet, her face tense with pain. "Mr. Harris," she greeted weakly, "I know why you're here, but please, I just lost my job. I just need a little more time. 3 weeks. That's all I'm asking for." Mr. Harris sighed, rubbing his temples like she was giving him a headache. "Angela, I'm sorry about what happened, but I have my own bills to pay. If you can't come up with rent in 3 weeks, you need to leave." Angela flinched, as if the words physically hurt her, but she nodded stiffly. 3 weeks, she whispered. 3 weeks to come up with money they didn't have. 3 weeks before they lost the only home they had left. 3 weeks before they were thrown into the streets with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. And as Malcolm sat at the small dining table that night, watching his mother push food around her plate with a hollow, vacant look in her eyes, something inside him snapped. He had already made a promise to himself that he would do whatever it took to help his mother. But now it wasn't just a promise. It was a vow. A vow that he wouldn't let them be destroyed. A vow that he would find a way to fix this. A vow that no matter what, he would not let the world break them, because if no one else was going to save them, then he would save them himself. Malcolm barely slept that night. The weight of their situation pressed against his chest like a heavy stone, refusing to let him breathe, refusing to let him rest. Every time he closed his eyes, all he could see was his mother's defeated face, her trembling hands, the landlord's cold stare, and the looming threat of eviction hanging over them like a noose. He lay in bed, staring up at the cracked ceiling, his mind racing through 1,000 impossible solutions, none of them realistic, none of them enough. "We have 3 weeks," the words replayed in his head over and over like a cruel countdown, reminding him that the life he had always known was on the verge of collapse. He turned his head slightly, his eyes landing on his mother, who was curled up on the couch, the same couch she had slept on for years just so Malcolm could have the only bed in their tiny apartment. She looked so small, so fragile, and for the first time in his life, Malcolm realized that his mother, his invincible, unstoppable mother, was just as human as everyone else. She wasn't unbreakable. She wasn't immune to pain. She wasn't a superhero. She was just a woman who had given everything she had to protect her son. And now she had nothing left. That thought made Malcolm's stomach churn with an emotion he had never felt before. Fear mixed with rage, helplessness mixed with determination. He couldn't just sit here. He couldn't wait for time to run out, for the landlord to show up and toss them into the street, for his mother to sink deeper into despair. He had to do something. Anything. Before the sun had even risen, Malcolm quietly got dressed, slipping on his worn-out sneakers and stuffing the last few dollars they had into his pocket. He scribbled a note and left it on the kitchen table. Went to look for work. Be back soon. Love you, Ma. Then he slipped out of the apartment and stepped into the cold morning air. New York City was already awake. Cars honked, people bustled down the sidewalks, shopkeepers rolled up their metal shutters, and the smell of coffee and exhaust filled the streets. Malcolm had no plan, no direction, just a single mission: find a job, find a way to make money, find a way to save his mother. He walked for miles, going from shop to shop, diner to diner, store to store, stepping inside each one with the same hopeful question, "Are you hiring?" Only to be met with the same crushing answer. "Sorry, kid, we don't hire minors. You're too young. Try back in a few years. Get out of here, boy. We don't have time for this." Each rejection hit harder than the last, but Malcolm refused to give up. He wandered deeper into the city, his stomach growling, his feet aching, but his determination unshaken. He stopped at a construction site, watching as men in hard hats carried heavy materials, sweat dripping from their brows. He approached the foreman, a burly man with a clipboard, and asked, "Sir, do you need help? I can work. I'll do anything." The man barely spared him a glance before scoffing. "You're just a kid. Get out of here before you get hurt." Malcolm clenched his fists. "I don't have time for this. I don't have time to be a kid." He kept going. A grocery store turned him away. A laundromat owner laughed at him. A mechanic shop told him to come back when he was 16. He was starting to lose hope. His legs were aching, his body exhausted, his mind screaming at him to give up. But then, just as he was about to turn back and return home in failure, he passed a small cafe on the corner of a busy street. The smell of fresh bread and coffee wafted out as a tired-looking man wiped down tables near the window. Something told Malcolm to try one last time. He pushed open the door, the bell jingling overhead, and approached the man behind the counter, a middle-aged guy with graying hair and a name tag that read Frank Whitman. Malcolm swallowed his nerves and stepped forward. "Sir," he said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion, "I'm looking for a job. I can wash dishes, clean tables, take out the trash, anything. I just need work." Frank looked up from the counter, his sharp blue eyes studying Malcolm for a long moment. "How old are you, kid?" 12, Malcolm admitted, bracing for rejection. But to his surprise, Frank didn't laugh, didn't immediately turn him away. Instead, he sighed and scratched the back of his head. 12, huh? You ever worked in a kitchen before?" Malcolm shook his head. "No, sir, but I learned fast. I can work hard." Frank exhaled through his nose, tapping his fingers against the counter before finally nodding. "All right, kid. I can't put you on payroll. Too many legal issues hiring someone your age. But if you're serious about working, you can wash dishes in the back. Pay small, cash only. Off the books. You do a good job, I'll keep you on for a while. Malcolm's heart leapt. A job. He had a job. Yes, sir, I'll do my best. Frank smirked slightly, shaking his head. All right. Get back there, grab an apron, sinks on the left, and, kid? Malcolm turned. Don't screw up. Malcolm nodded firmly. I won't. And with that, he stepped into the back of the cafe, rolled up his sleeves, and got to work. The sink was filled with dirty dishes, greasy pots, and stained coffee cups, but Malcolm didn't hesitate. He scrubbed, rinsed, dried, his hands moving faster than he thought possible, his mind focused on only one thing, earning enough money to save his mother. Hours passed, his arms ached, his fingers pruned, his back throbbed, but he didn't stop. He worked through the lunch rush, through the dinner hours, ignoring the heat, ignoring the exhaustion. He refused to stop. Finally, when the cafe closed for the night, Frank walked into the back, watching Malcolm wipe down the last of the dishes. You didn't quit, he said, sounding almost impressed. Malcolm shook his head. I can't quit. Frank studied him for a long moment before reaching into his pocket and pulling out a few crumpled bills. He held them out. Malcolm's fingers shook as he took them. His first paycheck. It wasn't much. It wasn't enough to save them yet, but it was something. And, for the first time since the explosion, since the phone call, since the landlord's warning, Malcolm felt something he hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. He tucked the money into his pocket and hurried home, practically running up the stairs to their apartment. The door creaked as he stepped inside, and there, sitting at the tiny kitchen table, was his mother. Her bandaged hands rested on her lap, her face pale and tired. She looked up at him, her expression filled with both relief and concern. Malcolm, where were you? I've been worried sick. Malcolm didn't say anything. Instead, he walked up to her, pulled the money from his pocket, and placed it gently on the table. Angela stared at it, then at him, her eyes widening. What is this? She whispered. Our first step, Malcolm said softly. I got a job, Ma. Angela's lips parted, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Then, slowly, she reached up and cupped his face with her trembling hands. Oh, my sweet boy, she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. And for the first time in a long time, she cried. Not out of sorrow, but out of pride. For the next week, Malcolm pushed himself harder than he ever had before. Every morning, he woke up before dawn, slipping out of the apartment quietly so his mother wouldn't worry. He walked the long stretch of city streets to reach Whitman's Cafe, the air cold against his skin, the streets still damp from the night before. The city wasn't fully awake yet, but Malcolm was. He had no time to rest, no time to be tired. He had a purpose now. Every dollar he earned meant they were one step closer to survival, one step further from losing their home, one step toward giving his mother a life where she didn't have to suffer anymore. The moment he stepped into the cafe, he threw on his apron, rolled up his sleeves, and dove straight into work, scrubbing dishes, sweeping floors, cleaning up after customers. No complaints. The work was grueling. The sink was always filled with dirty plates and greasy pans. The heat from the kitchen made sweat drip down his back. The constant rush of customers meant he barely had a moment to breathe. His arms ached, his hands turned raw from scrubbing, his fingers constantly pruned from being submerged in water all day. But he never stopped. Even when Frank, his tough but fair boss, warned him, "Kid, you keep working like that, you're going to burn out." Malcolm would only shake his head and keep going. He didn't have the luxury of slowing down. He barely ate during the day, stretching out whatever small meal he could afford with the tip money Frank would slip him every now and then. But hunger didn't matter. Exhaustion didn't matter. What mattered was going home at night, dropping a few more crumpled bills onto the kitchen table, and seeing the flicker of hope return to his mother's tired eyes. Angela tried to protest, tried to tell him he was too young to be working this hard, but Malcolm refused to listen. "I'm not going to let them take our home, Ma," he told her one night as they sat together at the table, the dim kitchen light flickering above them, his voice steady, stronger than any 12-year-old's should have been. Angela reached for his hand, her own trembling from the pain in her bandaged fingers. "Malcolm, this is not your burden to carry," she whispered, her voice thick with guilt. "You're just a boy." But Malcolm shook his head. Not anymore. And she knew he was right. The explosion, the hospital, the eviction notice. It had forced him to grow up too fast, had stolen the last remnants of his childhood, but Malcolm didn't mourn it. He embraced it. If losing his childhood meant saving his mother, then it was a price he was willing to pay. But fate, as always, had other plans. It happened one evening, just after Malcolm had finished his shift at the cafe. He was walking home, his pockets holding the weight of his hard-earned money, his body aching from exhaustion, when he heard something that made his blood turn cold. A voice. Soft, desperate, broken. "Please, someone, help me." Malcolm froze, his heart pounding as he turned toward the sound. The voice was coming from a dark alleyway just ahead. The streetlights barely reached inside, but even in the dim glow he could see a figure slumped against a wall. A woman. Her white dress, once beautiful, was now torn and stained with dirt. Her veil was ripped, her blonde hair tangled and messy. She looked like she had been running. Like she had been escaping from something. Or someone. Malcolm's feet moved before his brain could catch up. He rushed forward, his breath sharp in his chest, and dropped to his knees beside her. "Hey, are you okay?" The woman's eyes flickered open at the sound of his voice, her blue irises dull with exhaustion and fear. She looked at him like he was her last hope. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice shaking. "They're going to kill me." Malcolm's stomach twisted. Who was coming? And why did she look like she had just barely survived something horrible? He didn't have time to ask. Heavy footsteps echoed from the street behind him. Malcolm's instincts screamed at him to move, fast. Without hesitation, he grabbed the woman's arm, ignoring the way she winced, and pulled her up. "Come on," he urged, his voice urgent but steady. "We gotta get out of here." She didn't ask questions, she just followed. Malcolm led her through the alley, weaving through the shadows, his heart hammering as the sound of approaching voices grew louder. They were being followed. He could hear the men speaking, low, angry voices, cursing under their breath. Whoever they were hunting her. But Malcolm knew these streets better than anyone. He knew which paths led to dead ends and which ones could get them away. He took sharp turns, ducked behind dumpsters, kept his footsteps light, moved like a ghost through the city's underbelly. Finally, when he was sure they weren't being followed, he stopped, panting hard. The woman collapsed against the wall, her breath ragged. "Thank you," she gasped, looking at him with something that almost resembled awe. I don't even know your name." Malcolm straightened, his hands clenched into fists, his mind still racing. "Malcolm," he said. "Malcolm Johnson." The woman exhaled shakily, nodding. "I'm Isabella." She swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "Isabella Monroe." Malcolm's breath hitched. He knew that name. Everyone did. The Monroes were one of the wealthiest families in America. Their name constantly flashed across TV screens, magazine covers, news headlines. And Isabella? She was supposed to be marrying Jonathan Sterling, the heir to the Sterling Empire, a billionaire in his own right. It had been the society wedding of the year, a merger between two dynasties, a picture-perfect fairy tale. But here she was, dirty, terrified, running for her life. Malcolm swallowed hard, the weight of the situation sinking into his bones like cold steel. He had spent his entire life struggling just to survive, just to keep his mother afloat, just to make it to the next day. But now, he was caught up in something much bigger, much deadlier. If powerful men were after Isabella, then whoever was hunting her wouldn't stop just because she had found refuge with a 12-year-old boy. His first instinct was to walk away, to pretend he hadn't seen her, to save himself before he became another casualty in a war that wasn't his. But then he thought of his mother, her weak hands, her tired eyes, her whispered fears about their future. He thought about how the world had always been cruel to them, how no one had ever come to save them, how they had always been left to fend for themselves. And he knew he couldn't do the same to Isabella. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. Isabella nodded, her breath shaky, her blue eyes filled with desperation. She was older than him, probably in her mid-20s, but at that moment, she looked as lost as a child. Malcolm had seen that look before, in his mother, in himself, in every person the world chewed up and spit out. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded, though her body trembled from exhaustion. "Barely." "Then we gotta go. Now." He grabbed her wrist, firm but not rough, and pulled her forward, leading her out of the alley and into the quiet, darkened streets of the city. Malcolm moved quickly, his mind racing with possibilities, with dangers, with the weight of what he had just done. He had risked his life for a woman he didn't know, a woman who had come from a world so far removed from his own that it might as well have been another planet. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was getting her somewhere safe. He led Isabella through the back alleys of the city, staying in the shadows, keeping his head down. He knew these streets better than the men who hunted her ever could. He knew which roads to avoid, which corners had security cameras, which alleyways led to dead ends, and which led to escape. His heart was pounding, his legs were sore from running, but he didn't stop. Not until they reached the narrow, rusting stairwell that led to the back entrance of his apartment building. Isabella hesitated. This place was a far cry from the mansions and five-star hotels she was used to. The brick was old and cracked, the paint peeling, the dim hallway flickering with a single dying light bulb. But Malcolm didn't give her time to reconsider. He pulled open the door and motioned for her to follow. She did. The apartment was small, too small. The kitchen was barely more than a counter and a stove. The living room held only an old couch and a wobbly table. The single bedroom was the size of a closet. It wasn't much, but right now it was the safest place Isabella Monroe had in the world. As soon as they stepped inside, Angela Johnson looked up from the couch, her bandaged hands resting in her lap, her tired eyes widening in shock. "Malcolm, who—" Her voice trailed off when she saw the state of Isabella. Her torn wedding dress, her bruised arms, her tangled hair. Isabella met Angela's gaze, her lips parting slightly, as if she were ashamed to be standing there, as if she felt like an intruder in a world she didn't belong in. But Malcolm stepped between them, his voice steady, his expression unyielding. "She needs help." Angela's brows furrowed, confusion flickering across her face. But there was something else there, too. recognition. Because Angela, like Malcolm, had seen too many people in the world who had been beaten down, who had been abandoned, who had been forced to run. And so she didn't ask questions. She just nodded. Then we help her. Relief flooded through Isabella's face, and for the first time she looked like she might cry. Malcolm watched as his mother, despite the pain in her own body, moved to grab a blanket from the couch, draping it around Isabella's shaking shoulders. "Sit," Angela said softly, guiding her to the couch. "You're safe here." Isabella sank into the cushions, her body still trembling as if she couldn't quite believe what was happening. For a woman who had been raised in wealth, in luxury, this tiny, worn-down apartment should have been beneath her. But in that moment, it was a castle. It was a sanctuary. "Tell me," Angela said after a long pause, "who did this to you?" Isabella swallowed hard, staring down at her hands, at the tattered fabric of her dress. For a moment, Malcolm thought she wouldn't answer. But then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "Richard Sterling." Angela's breath hitched. Even Malcolm felt a cold chill crawl down his spine. He had heard that name before. Everyone had. Richard Sterling wasn't just a billionaire. He was one of the most powerful men in America, ruthless, dangerous, the kind of man who didn't ask for things. He took them. The kind of man who destroyed anyone who stood in his way. Malcolm didn't know much about the Sterling family, but he had seen their name on the news before. Corporate scandals, mysterious disappearances, corrupt deals. People feared Richard Sterling, but no one ever spoke out against him, because they didn't live long enough to. Angela's expression darkened. "You're engaged to his son, aren't you?" Isabella nodded, her fingers gripping the blanket tighter. "Jonathan," she whispered, "we love each other. We were supposed to be married today." Malcolm noticed the way her voice cracked, the way her body shuddered at the memory of whatever had happened before she had escaped. But his father didn't approve, Malcolm guessed. Isabella let out a short, bitter laugh. That's an understatement," she murmured. "He told me from the beginning that I wasn't the kind of woman he wanted for his son. He said I was weak, that I didn't belong in their family." She inhaled sharply, as if the memory alone was painful. Jonathan didn't care. He stood up to him. He told his father that he would marry me no matter what. She squeezed her eyes shut. "So Richard had me kidnapped. He was going to make sure the wedding never happened." Angela's hands clenched, her bandaged fingers curling slightly. Malcolm felt his stomach twist in anger. This wasn't just some rich family drama. This was life and death. "And now?" Angela asked. "Now he's trying to kill you?" Isabella nodded slowly, her face pale. "He sent people after me," she whispered. "If they find me, they won't let me live." A thick silence filled the room. Malcolm felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, on all of them. This wasn't just about Isabella anymore. It was about surviving. If Richard Sterling wanted her dead, he would stop at nothing to make sure it happened. And now, by helping her, Malcolm and his mother were caught in the crossfire. They were harboring a woman who was being hunted by one of the most powerful men in the country. One wrong move, and they could be next. Angela looked at Malcolm, her tired eyes searching his face as if trying to decide whether or not to send Isabella away. But then Malcolm saw something shift in his mother's gaze. Something fierce. Something unbreakable. She wasn't afraid. She had spent her whole life fighting to survive, and she wasn't going to stop now. "Then we keep you safe," Angela said simply. Isabella's eyes widened. But no buts. Angela cut her off, her voice firm. "You're here now, and that means you're under my roof, and as long as you're under my roof, no one touches you." Isabella's lips trembled as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you help me?" Angela exhaled, glancing at Malcolm, and then, softly, she said the words that would define the moment forever. "Because no one helped me when I needed it." Malcolm felt something deep inside him stir. He had always known his mother was strong, but this was something else. Isabella wasn't just a rich woman on the run anymore. She was family now, and family protected each other, no matter what. But as they sat there in the quiet of the night, as Isabella wrapped the blanket tighter around herself and Angela sat beside her, Malcolm couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something dark, something unstoppable. Because Richard Sterling wasn't the kind of man who gave up easily. And the war had only just begun. Malcolm was just trying to survive, but one fateful night changed everything. A dangerous chase, a powerful enemy, and a choice that could cost him everything. What happened next will shock you. Stay until the end to see how one boy's courage defied all odds. If you stand for justice, comment 77. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below